Hey guys, I'm here for the penultimate Women's Prize review on Three Things About Elsie by Joanna Cannon. I really didn't get along with this book, to put it mildly. But in honor of all the prior effort I've put in to have this complete series, I am going to review it. So if you enjoy negative reviews for whatever reason, savor this one because it'll be the last from me for a while. And if you're a fan of this book, it has lots of fans. And if you think it would hurt your heart to hear someone disassemble it, no need to put yourself through that. Consider not watching. This mostly follows an old British woman named Florence who's in an elderly care facility with her lifelong best friend Elsie. Early on, she's told by the staff that if she continues to deteriorate mentally and socially, she'll be placed in another elderly home, one for much sicker people, and she dreads this possibility. The issue is a new man arrives at Florence's care facility, and she thinks he's an ominous figure from her past, and that he's setting up certain situations to make it look like she's losing her mind, but no one will believe her. There are elements of this book that, when divorced from the overall tone and execution, are really interesting to think about. We're in the first-person perspective of a woman whose age makes you automatically question her reliability, and Cannon wants you to confront that fact. So for example, Florence is fixated on this elephant figurine that's always turned a certain way, but one day she comes back and finds that it has been shifted. She is positive she didn't do this, that somebody else came into her rooms, but as the reader, you're given plenty of reasons to doubt her. And so, like with Elizabeth is Missing by Emma Healy, this is a book about the losses you face as an elderly person, especially the loss of dignity and the way that people stop believing that your perspective counts. Now, I struggle with sentimentality much more than the average person, probably. I was thinking about my dad and how some things that he finds touching, I find gauche. Things that might make him tear up, might make me shudder. And so I recognize that for people who have different natural sensibilities from me, they might find this heartwarming, where I personally found it uncomfortable. And the fact that I'm cynical doesn't mean that I'm more sophisticated. It just means that we have different emotional palettes. I did find this book sickly sweet. It made me groan on almost every page. My neighbors probably thought I was getting a root canal or something without anesthesia. But the bigger issues to me, beyond personal sensibilities, are that it's poorly constructed and contradictory. We have this framing device that's largely unnecessary. Florence has a bad fall when she's alone, so she's lying on the floor for hours, and there are these really nice passages where she's imagining someone coming to help her. Here's a taste of one of those. Perhaps it will be Miss Ambrose who finds me. Perhaps she'll come over early for our weekly chat, and she'll worry when I don't answer the door. She'll have to use her keys in the end, but she'll struggle with the lock, and the keys will drop to the floor because she's rushing so much. When she gets inside, she'll say, "Florence, whatever have you been doing?" I'll put her mind at ease straight away. "Don't worry about me, Miss Ambrose," I'll say. "I just had a little tumble. I'm as right as rain." She'll hold my hand whilst we wait for the ambulance. She'll smile down at me and say how worried everyone will be when they hear what's happened, and I will smile back and say how nice it is to be worried about. Even though she's busy, she'll come with me to the hospital. "Nothing is as important as you, Florence. Everything else can wait." Now, we only needed one repetition of this thought process to meaningfully drive it home. You can bet we get more than that. There are way too many of these asides to Florence on the floor. And the thing is, Cannon creates this frame mostly to give Florence time and reason to reflect, but the rest of the book offers plenty of reflection. So clearly this protagonist doesn't need this awkward setup as an excuse to look back on her life. That's what she does all the time anyway. And even though this framing has some plot significance, which I would argue is unnecessary in the end anyway, we could have returned to it 3 times total throughout the novel, and not periodically in this tiresome way. Sentence by sentence, there's so much awkward writing in here. It's a kind of forced whimsy, and you can find moments of awkward phrasing in almost any book. So when I mention examples, it's because I think they're representative of a lot of the writing. After a character's nap, we get this. "She had marks on her cheek where the pillow had pressed itself into her thoughts." Are your thoughts on your face? What is happening? Then Florence has a moment where she remembers being angry. "I left Elsie's house full of breath." Well, I hope for her sake that she had breath in her body. If this is meant to demonstrate that she was angry, the actual image is of somebody going which makes no sense. Here's another. I could smell the earth resting against the October air and the rain gathered into pools on the plastic. Does the earth rest against the air? Like, what is that trying to evoke? There are just so many of these moments where Cannon's attempting quirkiness, but the result is nonsense, and we'll get back to the issue of forced cutesiness later. Continuing on the technical side of things, the plotting is ridiculous. On the inside cover and several times throughout the book, we get this setup. There are 3 things you should know about Elsie. The first thing is that she's my best friend. The second is that she always knows what to say to make me feel better. And the third thing might take a little bit more explaining. Okay, I guessed from the jacket what the third thing was. It's quite the obvious twist, which isn't necessarily a problem, and I partly assumed that Cannon intended that. But because the revelation is deferred until the very end, it made me wonder if it was supposed to be suspenseful, and the delay means that the text has almost no time to grapple with that revelation's implications, which are interesting. Instead, we get the same interactions again and again without the book taking the opportunity to develop and examine itself anew in light of these facts. Then the resolution of the big conflict is humdrum and oddly handled after such a drawn-out book. This puppy is 450 pages, and yes, it's printed so that you can read it from space, but it feels its length. Then there are massive coincidences scattered throughout. Dickens would read some of these and be like, that was a stretch. The purpose of them, for the most part, is to heavy-handedly show that you can never be sure of the difference you make in others' lives. And Cannon means this sincerely, but it's a questionable strategy to make a serious point in such a ludicrous fashion. Like, how am I supposed to take that message seriously under the circumstances? Going broader now, there are 2 main ways I think this book works against its own goals. And the first is the more significant. Above all else, it's trying to represent the humanity of elderly people, but it doesn't make these characters human. It just makes them old. I tend to avoid books that feature elderly protagonists because the vast majority fall into what I think of as the fictional old person recipe, which is a handful of quirks mixed in with some traits that are common to old people. These eccentricities that are thrown together and are meant to constitute a personality. They don't. Florence has her quirks. One is that she often states something and then backs it up by saying, I read it, period, in a magazine. Always 2 sentences, never one. We're supposed to chuckle when it appears. When she gets upset, she shouts and doesn't realize that she's shouting. And she frequently says something to the effect of, I may not be allowed to decide much, but I can still decide such and such. Added to these behaviors are time-honored stereotypes. Florence complains about people wasting food and being too lazy to pick up a needle and fix their own clothes. She believes she's a much more thorough cleaner than any of the young cleaning ladies who come around to help her, and she laments that the younger generations can't have a proper conversation and don't take time to appreciate the world around them, those sorts of things. We're also told that Florence is kind and bubbly and thoughtful, and we see evidence of these qualities occasionally, and there are legitimate reasons that she can't quite grasp the person she used to be. But for the most part, she's just the fictional old person recipe. And what bothers me is that my grandmother is far more particular and complicated than any of the characters in this book. But it's difficult for her to open any book and find characters her age who aren't reduced to representing aging. Does she have her eccentricities? Yes. Does she fall into some elderly stereotypes? For sure. But those things don't make her who she is. And so this book isn't well equipped to handle this theme of honoring the perspectives of the elderly when it's largely relying on gimmicks to portray them. And like a lot of young authors writing old characters, Cannon's counting on you projecting, on you recognizing these traits in some of the old people that you know, and transplanting their specificity onto characters that are otherwise lazily drawn. The second contradictory factor is that this gently chastises people for being patronizing toward the elderly. But the book is patronizing toward its readers. I went to Catholic church every week for 18 years. There's a specific mental entrapment you experience when you know someone's about to deliver a stilted sermon and you just have to sit there and take it. And this book Sure took me back. The most obvious example of this is the way the elderly home's youngish handyman Simon is employed by the narrative. It is unbelievably ham-handed. He walks around with no discernible personality other than, you guessed it, a few quirks, wondering aloud, what is my purpose in life? What do I excel at? What are my goals? See, Simon doesn't believe that he has any talents or any direction in his life, but by the end of the book, you can bet that we'll have discovered a talent Simon never knew he had, and he'll have kindly reminded us that no matter what direction our lives take, all of us matter. Near the end, we get even more cutesy moments piling on, and there's such a false ring to so many of them. So we get this Simon revelation. Perhaps a name didn't really mean much at all, Simon thought. Perhaps it was just another thing to carry around, like your date of birth and your national insurance number. Perhaps what really made you you was where you were now, what you wanted to be, and how you decided to get there. Soon after, Florence tells Simon the first two things about Elsie, but can't recall the third. And Simon responds, well then, perhaps the third thing wasn't that important after all. Perhaps it didn't make much of a difference in the end. As an aside, it is important, and there is a difference. Then we go back to Florence on the floor so she can drop some knowledge. We benchmark our lives with birthdays and Christmases and holidays, but perhaps we should think more about the ordinary days, the days that pass by and we don't even notice. Elsie once said that you can't tell how big a moment is until you turn back and look at it, and I think, perhaps, that she was right. You'll notice that all of these use perhaps, not to mean maybe, but to bestow faux gravity on the real meaning, which is definitively these things are true. These characters seesaw between interacting like people and serving Cannon's purposes. She wants you to come away with specific messages, and gosh darn it, she's gonna shape these characters as vessels for those messages. There's a moment when Florence walks into a library and thinks, I couldn't believe how big it was. Who knew there were so many stories that needed telling? To which I say, is this a children's book? Because honestly, I wouldn't take kindly to any children of mine being condescended to in this fashion. So clearly I don't think this book has much to offer, but plenty of other readers have disagreed, so do check out opposing opinions if you're interested in the premise. Mostly this experience was a reminder of the main weakness of this overall project, which is that I haven't been giving myself room to step away from a book. And if I wrote a novel that someone were hating the experience of reading, I'd be like, put it down. I don't want anyone suffering over my book. And I'm guessing that Joanna Cannon feels exactly the same way. So I'm resolved to DNF books in the future that make me feel like this, and we'll all be better for that. And I'm relieved to put this one in the rearview mirror. Let me know what you think about Three Things About Elsie, whether you agree or disagree, and I'll see you soon for the final Women's Prize review. Bye guys. Thanks for watching.